I'm Scott.
I'm Bill.
And we're the Trade Guys.
You're listening to The Trade Guys, a podcast produced by CSIS where we talk about trade in terms that everyone can understand. I'm H. Andrew Schwartz, and I'm here with Scott Miller and Bill Reinsch, the CSIS Trade Guys. Coming up next on The Trade Guys, Donald Trump is the president-elect, and of course that means Tariff Man is back. We'll discuss all of that coming up right now on The Trade Guys. Guys, this is incredible. Tariff Man is back. We are back. Lest we remind all of our audience that we started the Trade Guys because of Tariff Man. In 2016, when Tariff Man first took office, there was a 4-year respite now, but Tariff Man is back. We're talking on November 7th, a couple days after the election. We don't yet know the makeup of the House of Representatives. We know the Senate is solidly Republican. We know the president-elect is Tariff Man, Donald J. Trump. And boy, do we have a lot to talk about.
Yes, indeed. First of all, for Bill and I, regardless of our politics or our personal feelings, I think it's important to underscore that Donald J. Trump has been very good for business.
Yeah, after all, you guys are trade guys. Donald Trump, a.k.a. Tariff Man, is a trade guy.
He made us. Made us what we are. And we'll continue to try to unpack what's going on in the world of international economics and trade and put it in language that everybody can understand, which was what he did in his original campaign. He started talking about trade, got it on the front page of newspapers, and voters were like, what's this about? So now there are very few newspapers and they don't print front pages. But 8 years later, we expect trade and tariffs to still be a prominent issue and a need for us to talk about it in some way that's useful to the audience.
That's right. So, Scott, I want to open this up and ask you, what do we expect from the Trump Econ team? Who do we expect to be on the Trump Econ team? We've talked a lot on this podcast during the long campaign season about Trump's comments on tariffs, that he's going to raise tariffs significantly on China. Who is really going to be making policy here?
What I've noticed is it's a very different Trump campaign and a very different Donald Trump than it was 8 years ago. He was a total outsider. And with 4 years out of office, it strikes me he's been thinking about the mistakes he made and what he's going to do differently. And that's been reflected in the way he approached the campaign. One of the things I noticed was his ability and then willingness to involve others in the campaign. They had this sort of Justice League going on with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard, Elon Musk, and even at the end, believe it or not, Megyn Kelly.
Yeah.
Quite remarkable change in demeanor and approach on the campaign trail. And I think we're going to see that reflected in his new administration. Though don't know yet. I know he has confessed to doing a bad job of personnel, which those of us who watched him in his first term were really concerned about the way he manages the day-to-day politics, particularly personnel. So he knows he didn't do it as well as he should have the last time. I think we'll see some changes. So here's at least my expectation. First, I don't think tariffs will play a smaller role, but I do think there's a big economic program which will happen in the first year. This is based on my expectation that you will have a Republican Senate and a Republican House of Representatives. If you do, well, what I think they'll do is set a goal of about 4% economic growth and 2% inflation, and they'll put together tax policy, energy policy, and regulatory policy to try to deliver that. Now, regulation will take longer to penetrate the economy, always does. But I think if that alignment holds up, given the expiry of the 2018 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, 2018 was when it was first implemented, given the expiry, they'll want to get their tax policy started early. And I think they will also do some reduction in spending. My guess is there's a lot of unobligated funds from the Inflation Reduction Act, from the CHIPS Act, and from the infrastructure bill that they will want to use as offsets for tax policy in the context of reconciliation, where you need to show reduction in the deficits over the 10-year window. But I think that's going to be the work initially. Then in terms of staffing, it's interesting. His advisors this time on macroeconomic issues identify a couple of people who could be very good Treasury secretaries. Scott Bessent of Key Services Capital Management and Howard Lutwick of Cantor Fitzgerald. Both are in their mid-60s. Both are macro people, know the economy well, but they would be a figure like Robert Rubin was in the Clinton administration, which would be an overall firm hand on macro. And I think that will affect the degree to which tariff policy is front and center. But I do think tariffs will remain sort of the real politic of the Trump administration, part two. I expect him to be more like Richard Nixon and look at reciprocity and unfair trade and look for bargaining to solve problems rather than a complete return to the high tariff policies of, say, William McKinley, which he's talked about in the campaign trail. So that's how I expect it to play out. Getting growth going, getting the tax bill fundamentals down, and finding some savings and finding things to accelerate economic growth will be the top priority.
All right, Bill's chomping at the bit. Bill, what are your thoughts?
Well, I have to disagree with Scott for once on a number of things. I would say on personnel, he did it right the first time because he hired sane people and then proceeded not to take their advice. I mean, he had more than his share of incompetence, but the people who were at Treasury and in the White House tended to be people that had the capabilities that you want to run the government. I'm worried about this time that he's basically going to bring in a whole bunch of yes people who will tell him exactly what he wants to hear, and he's going to do exactly what he wants, which, may or may not be rational. I guess we'll see. I don't know the people that Scott mentioned. I don't think they have Rubin's stature, but, maybe they will.
No, probably not.
I'm not sure that I agreed with, in retrospect, what Rubin did, but another story.
He was a very effective Treasury Secretary, though.
Yeah. What worries me about what Scott said is what they're talking about doing is going to blow an enormous hole in our deficit. We are already deeply in debt, multiple trillions. And what he's proposed so far is another $7.75 trillion of additional debt. I think he's demonstrated throughout his personal career that he doesn't care about debt. He's gone bankrupt several times. And, debt is something that you just, dump on other people and don't pay your bills. I am worried that that's what's going to happen to the country. At some point, I don't know when that point is, and it may be a long time, but we reach a tipping point where the debt is unsustainable. People lose confidence in the dollar. They lose confidence in the United States. As they start losing confidence in the dollar and start selling it, then we're going to have a huge economic problem. And what he's doing is going to move us down that path faster than otherwise. So I'm worried about that, and I'm worried about the process they're going to employ. And here, a tiny little political science lesson. If the Republicans control the House, and I think they will, we're in a situation where they're going to do a reconciliation bill. And reconciliation bills are attractive because they allow you to avoid a Senate filibuster. You can pass them with 51 votes. That means that there's an enormous effort to cram all kinds of things into them. And it's harder in the Senate. The Senate actually has very strict rules, stricter than the House, about what can go into a reconciliation bill, thanks to the late Senator Robert C. Byrd, and put in the Byrd rule. But even so, it's a chance to make big changes in a situation where the Democrats can't get in the way. And that last statement is important because it's going to change the dynamic of the debate. If the Democrats control the House, then there's going to have to be compromise between the Republicans and the Democrats. If the Republicans control the House, then the compromise is going to have to be amongst Republicans. The Democrats will be irrelevant. And the challenge will be, can the Republicans themselves unite on anything? And the last 2 years have demonstrated, at least in the House, that that's very difficult.
Yes. Now, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed under reconciliation, and the leadership of Speaker Paul Ryan and Ways and Means Chairman Kevin Brady made that happen. It was a very difficult process. It had 1-seat majority in the Senate. So that's the underlying tax policy that they're going to try to either extend or modify.
Yeah. What you end up with there is a lot of other things. When I was in the Clinton administration, they tried to use reconciliation to abolish the Department of Commerce. And it didn't succeed. In fact, the secretary put me in charge of a task force to make sure they didn't succeed. A lot of good arguments about why that was a stupid idea, but also a lot of sleepless nights worrying about what could happen because we could not rely on the Democratic minority to block it. Mm-hmm. And so getting things in is a significant battle. And I'm worried about that because it means they're going to pass something that may end up long-term, not sort of short-term, imposing enormous costs on the economy. The other thing I'd say is that, what he wants to do? He wants to juice up the economy and promote growth. And I'm inclined to think that that is exactly the wrong thing to do right now because we're on the right trajectory. And there's a history lesson here that, Biden has suffered from the same thing that Bill Clinton gained from. And remember Jim Carville saying, it's the economy, stupid. And that's sort of what Trump ran on also. Clinton ran on in 1992 on the recession that we were in at the time, blamed the Republicans who were in at the time, and won.
George Herbert Walker Bush famously back then was accused of not knowing how a grocery checkout line worked.
Yes, exactly. So what nobody noticed was the recession was over 2 months before the election.
Correct.
And so we were on the right path economically. Clinton came in, it got better. He took credit, some of which he deserved because of the budget bill that he got enacted early in his term. But, Bush deserves some credit too. Things were moving in the right direction. And what I'd say now is things are moving in the right direction. Inflation is down almost to 2%. Growth is up. Unemployment is down. The soft landing that people speculated about is there. We're doing everything right. And Trump is about to come in and make exactly the mistake that the younger Bush, George W., made in 2001 when the economy was also in good shape and moving forward. And he passed this enormous tax bill and squandered the surplus that Clinton had built up. So, I think historically people are going to look back at this and say, just as Biden provided stimulus that we probably didn't need in 2021, Trump is going to provide overstimulus that we don't need in 2025. And then we're all going to pay for it with a debt bomb at a later date. I do want to talk about trade, but I'll stop here and go back to Scott, and then I'll come back to me and we'll talk about trade.
Well, yeah, these parallels exist throughout American history and probably world history. But what you're describing is the situation that we're in now because no one defended Bidenomics after the public soured on it. And we had a long campaign with a record level of spending. And Vice President Harris, when asked directly, said she wouldn't change a thing. And yet there was no defense as you're making now. So, yeah, you may be right, Bill, but I don't think it will matter going forward. I think we've got voters with an appetite for intervention and a changing geopolitical situation.
There's an appetite for change.
Yes.
I don't think they have any idea of what the right answer to do about it. There's been polling data on this. An enormous percentage of Republicans, in fact, I can look on this in a minute and tell you, which I just had a lot of trouble believing this, 80% of Trump voters thought that the inflation rate is rising, while in fact it's down 2.4%. It's down from 9.1% 2 years ago. Half of Trump voters thought illegal immigration is increasing, when it's down 58% in the last year. Nobody's dealing with ignorance. It drives me crazy.
Well, The Myth of the Rational Voter was a famous book by Tyler Cowen published, and he was right 20 years ago. He's right now. So.
Well, but worries me, let's turn to trade for a minute. And I'm not going to talk about tariffs for a minute. Scott can talk about the tariffs. I will too. But I want to talk about some of the things fall in behind the tariffs, because what he's really going to end up doing, I think, is unraveling the trading system in a way that is going to come back and bite us over a long term, because it creates the law of the jungle. And he's fine with that because his view is, in the jungle, the big cats win. And he views the United States as a big cat. So, in that kind of context, we win. And I think in reality, in a global environment, it's a lot more complicated than that. The U.S. share of global GDP has been declining. It will continue to decline, particularly as emerging economies, particularly in Southeast Asia, begin to grow a lot faster than we are. But what he is doing, and in fairness, what he's going to do, and in fairness, it's what Biden has been doing indirectly, is undermining the trading system by ignoring the rules. And, Trump is going to impose tariffs that will break the rules. Monday, he was talking about 100% tariffs on Mexico, on everything. That was because he wants to leverage them on migration, not on trade. But, that would break the USMCA agreement into pieces. A 10% global tariff would violate all of our WTO obligations. Tariffs on China would do the same. And I think the result would be that he would pull out of the WTO, which he did not do the last time. And it would cause a wave of global retaliation against us. And so we're in an every man for himself environment. And I can't possibly think that's good for us in the long run.
Yes, but this is just a continuation of where we've been. Look, the geopolitics have changed. Okay, and there was a time during the Cold War where the United States went to great lengths to protect the trading system. And DeBisi is right, because it was an important element of our geopolitical strategy of keeping allies and partners engaged, right? And lo and behold, it's really not particularly effective at doing that right at the moment, or we have different geopolitical aims. And so I thought that by disabling the appellate body, that Ambassador Lighthizer saw something that the rest of us missed. What he saw was, this is a great parking place for people to complain about issues but not do anything. And that's what the WTO became. it became sort of an energy sink.
But it wasn't that, Scott, as long as we had the appellate body, because then something could actually happen.
Yes, and I think that's what Lighthizer wanted to use it for. Ambassador Lighthizer was no dummy about these things, and he achieved it. And that policy worked out for the Biden administration, too. Now, this is despite a campaign of Biden's talking to the Europeans about, hey, the adults are back, everything's going to be fine now. And then he continued the same policy for 4 years. So I look at that and say, what did Ambassador Lighthizer know that Team Biden carried through on that? And I think what they knew was we weren't going to accomplish a lot on the upside with the WTO, but it was a great place to park issues and sort of let the steam cool off and get on with other things. But this is why I think that they're going to run a very reciprocal trade. It's Trade Act of 1974 all over, Bill, where you've got 301 for the trade disputes, and you've got tough bargaining on specific sectors, much like was provided for in the 74 Trade Act. I think that's where we're going.
That's not where we're going, and it's not 74 all over again, because what they're talking about is a reciprocal tariff system in which we impose tariffs that are equivalent to the other country's tariffs. So if India has a 40% tariff on steel, we will have a 40% tariff on their steel. And if the EU has a 15% tariff on steel, we'll have a 15% tariff on their steel. So we will have 166 minimum, because that's the number of WTO members, different tariff schedules, each matching the tariffs that the other country puts out. Number one, it blows the whole system up. But the other thing about it that nobody's talking about it, and Lighthizer hasn't talked about it, is it puts our policy in the hands of the other guys. Because all we're doing is saying, we're going to match whatever you do.
Yes.
So if you're high, we'll be high. Look at it this way. So Colombia, major coffee producer, let's say hypothetically, has a big tariff on coffee because they want to keep their competitors out and protect their coffee industry. So say it's 50%. So what does the United States do under Lighthizer's proposal? We have a 50% tariff on Colombian coffee. Why does that make any sense?
Well, yes, but Bill, I think you're merging two ideas. You're confusing the opening bargaining position with the ultimate conclusion. Okay. And I've been around real estate developers.
So, yeah, I don't think Bill's confusing it, Scott.
It's much of my life. I've known real estate developers, and they all start out from the outrageous offer and negotiate down to something that's reasonable.
Well, this one we're negotiating with ourselves because this would require legislation.
Well, yes.
This is not something that Trump can do by himself.
Well, look, I don't think legislation is going to be a problem.
Well, then we're in deep water. If Congress passes this, it's an enormous mistake.
That's true. And I don't think Congress would pass it. But then again, nobody thought Reed Smoot was going to lose control of the process in the Senate Finance Committee. And he did. So we had Smoot-Hawley.
And somebody should remind him that he lost re-election after he did that.
Yes, both Smoot and Hawley lost.
Yes, don't remind them.
Both Smoot and Hawley lost.
Yes.
Hawley was a congressman from Ohio. Yeah, so Reed Smoot was a Utah senator.
Well, okay, guys, I got to ask you, amid this conversation, which is, of course, fascinating.
Polite term. All right, go ahead. Andrew's being polite. We could tell.
Yeah, are we going to have a chaotic economic policy, or is it going to be organized and centered in real thought and real planning?
The former.
Bill will have his own views, but here's my thinking. What is different now? We used to treat trade as different from regulation and taxation. So it's no big deal when companies go, when there's a tax bill pending, and try to carve out a specific provision that is better for their company. And they make the case, and the tax writing committees work on it. And so the tax code is full of lots of twists and turns that are there because they improve conditions for some American firm or set of workers. Same thing is true with regulation. The regulated industry puts great effort in modifying the regulations to make sure they can benefit from them in circumstances at least they can operate on an even playing field. But somehow when we get to tariffs, we get all libertarian on ourselves. Okay. And my view has changed on this. Now, keep in mind, I'm a free trader. Okay. I personally believe that you get a buyer and seller together. They ought to be free to conclude whatever business they want to conclude and keep the government out of it to the extent possible. I also spent a long time professionally with a company that thought the consumer was boss. And open markets and free trade tend to be good for the consumer. But I'm revisiting this notion because all the Trump administration and the Biden administration demonstrated is you can treat trade policy the way you treat regulatory and tax policy and drive the incentives by managing it more specifically. Maybe a bad idea. Maybe it's going to backfire. But I think that's where the domestic politics are taking us.
Well, the difference is the regulatory matters and the other things you described take place in a domestic context. And there's a final arbiter, the legislature and the courts, and the issue gets settled. Trade policy doesn't take place in a domestic context. You're dealing with other sovereign countries that are going to do what they're going to do. And if you decide, let's do what's good for America, that's fine. They're going to do what's good for India or what's good for Vietnam or what's good for China, which is not good for us. And there's nothing we can do about that in a disordered, fragmented international trading system with no rules. We are stuck. Our response is going to be, well, you put 100% tariff on, we'll put a 200% tariff on, and you have escalating tariffs. That's how we ended up with the Depression.
Well, it's some of how we ended up with the Depression.
It made it worse. It did not start it.
It did make it worse, but the whole picture has got to include the fact that I think what the president-elect's team wants to do is make the United States the best place to invest, the best place to conduct commerce. And they see it as if there are trade barriers that would improve the incentives for domestic production, domestic employment, they're going to take them.
Well, yes. They're also going to do things that are going to disincentivize foreigners from coming here. I mean, Trump is saying the point of high tariffs is to force companies to move here. And he was explicit about that when Bloomberg interviewed him. The tariffs are high enough, they'll come here because that way they avoid the tariff, which ignored one, that you don't just close your factory in Paris on Friday and, open one in Atlanta on Monday. Moving takes years, usually. It's a complicated process, number one.
There are subtleties involved. It's not as black and white as the president-elect had presented it.
But the other part of it is, the rest of the world is moving on and there's other alternatives. The United States is a less hospitable environment. You don't know what he's going to do. So let's focus on India. Let's focus on Thailand. Let's focus on Indonesia. Why waste my time being frustrated with the United States when there are easier targets from a market standpoint?
Yes, good question. And I think that when you have a deal maker as your president, the initial offer, the initial statement might be very different than the ending point of view. We saw that in the first term.
Right. But I guess part of the question is the deal maker going to be informed by strategy and philosophy, or is this freewheeling time?
Well, it depends who he surrounds himself with. Look, I thought Wilbur Ross was a brilliant industrialist, but not a great advisor as a commerce secretary.
He was a brilliant acquirer of companies.
Yeah, he did a wonderful job acquiring, this sort of like the same Warren Buffett did for a long time.
Hollowing them out and firing people. But
undervalued companies and managing them. So
Bill's in rare form today, Scott, as we could have imagined before the podcast began.
Yes. The grumpiness is a special effect here today.
But Trump's fundamental attitude is, actually, it's very much the same as Xi Jinping's, which is, we're big, you're small, you should shut up and do what we tell you. And other countries, they're not going to do that. And Trump's view is access to the American market is so attractive that companies and countries will pay for it. And I think he's going to find that there's declining interest in that. And then we suffer, because this goes back to something that I know Scott and I do agree on. 96% of the world's consumers are outside our borders. If the American economy is going to grow at more than 2% a year, it has to trade. It has to be involved internationally. And he is pursuing policies that, in fact, are going to be the opposite.
The wonderful thing about Washington, Bill, is there's always a counter pressure. There's always a counter argument. And these things get pushed to the center before they become law and before they become policy. So I'm less worried, having seen what happened in the first term. And I do think that the voters are ready for change. I mean, one of the things that I heard someone quote Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, which was, why should we pay other countries who hate us? They should be able to hate us for free. So there is that sense of we got to do this ourselves.
One story and one bellwether. I was talking to my wife about this today, and she was talking to a neighbor who told her about somebody that she knows who works for a small manufacturing company. It was probably in the Rust Belt somewhere, where the workers clearly had all voted for Trump. And after the election, the company president got them all together and said, I'm sorry to tell you that I can't give anybody Christmas bonuses this year because I've used all the money to pre-order equipment that we're going to need next year to beat the tariffs. That's what's going to happen, and people are going to regret the vote that they cast. The bellwether that you ought to look at, just because it's interesting, is what is he going to do or try to do about the dollar? Because here you've got Trump on record frequently saying, I believe in a strong dollar. We need a strong dollar. His election, if you look at the tracking of financial markets, currency markets on Tuesday night, big boost to the dollar, which rose against virtually every other currency. Strong dollar. And here you, at the same time, you've got Lighthizer saying, we need a weak dollar because only with a weak dollar are we going to be able to reduce the trade deficit. And he's right about that.
Yes.
I would refer our listeners to Scott's wonderful series about the dollar, which you can find on CSIS's YouTube channel.
Yes. Tell me why I'm wrong, Scott.
Well, thanks for the plug. And no, I think that Lighthizer's view of the dollar is not the controlling opinion within the first Trump administration and probably won't be in the second. I think markets correctly picked up that the president-elect favors a strong dollar. Yesterday, as the Dow Jones Industrial Average went up 1,000 points or so, gold had a bad day. Gold dropped significantly after, a 5-year bull market. But that's really not gold dropping as much as it is the dollar strengthening. So, I think strong dollar is what the markets expect. There's a reason they expect it. They're not crazy. And this is, I guess, my overall conclusion then is let's see what happens. Let's not overreact. Let's not panic about tariffs. Let's make the best case for what's good for America and presume that the administration is going to want that.
So you're saying we should keep calm and carry on.
That's correct. That's a great way to put it.
Thank you, Margaret Thatcher. That's great.
I got to contribute something today, Bill,
As a practical matter, we don't have any choice.
Right.
We're not in the government, but we will be here continuing to comment and second guess everybody else. That's the fun part.
And I'm going to say don't panic, and Bill's going to say this is a perfectly good time to panic.
That's why this show is so great. And our listeners, to all of our listeners, we are back in full force. We are here with you to hold your hand through tariff this and tariff that. And we got a lot to talk about coming up in these next 4 years, boys.
It'll be fun.
You got it.
Now, having said that, I should alert everybody, we're taking a week off next week.
Yeah, we're taking a week off. So we'll be back the following week. Same tariff time, same tariff channel.
And maybe we have more facts next time in terms of who's who.
That would be an unprecedented development.
I got to tell Evan, our producer here, that, that reference was to the old Batman show. Evan's too young to know about the Batman show of the 60s.
Yes.
And the 70s. And, anyway, look, guys, we got a lot to talk about. It's exciting. And there's no two people I'd rather talk about it than with you guys. So thanks very much. We'll be back in a week.
Thank you, Andrew.
To our listeners, if you have a question for the Trade Guys, write us at tradeguys@csis.org. That's tradeguys@csis.org. We'll read some of your emails and have the Trade Guys react to it. You've been listening to The Trade Guys, a CSIS podcast.